Before Oxford became one of the most famous centers of learning in the world, it did not begin as an academic dream, nor as a city obviously destined for greatness. Its beginning was far more ordinary. It was a place where people could cross a river. That is the practical truth at the root of everything. A shallow point in the water, a useful passage through mud, reeds, and current. A path for livestock, traders, travelers, pilgrims, and soldiers. Even the name itself points back to that plain reality. A ford for oxen, not a city of ideas, not a sacred capital of knowledge, just a useful crossing. But history has a habit of noticing useful places. And once history notices a place, that place begins to change. In the Roman period, there is evidence of settlement in the area. That does not mean Oxford was already a major urban center, but it does suggest something important. This location had value. Roman occupation followed patterns of movement, administration, and control. A crossing point mattered. Roads, trade routes, military logic, and local geography all made certain places more important than they first appeared. Oxford entered history not because of myth, but because of position. That pattern continued in the Saxon era. What had once been only a practical location slowly became a community. With St. Friedwald and the establishment of an early religious house in the 8th century, the place gained a spiritual layer. This matters because Oxford began to shift from being somewhere people merely passed through to somewhere people stayed, a place of prayer, a place of gathering, a place where life could be organized around something more than movement. Geography was beginning to turn into society. Then, in the early 10th century, under Edward the Elder, a fortified burh was established. Once again, Oxford changed roles. A place that had value because it could be crossed, now had value because it could be defended. This is one of the recurring patterns in the history of great cities. Before they become centers of culture, they often become points of strategy. Oxford was no exception. It had become something worth holding. Yet early Oxford was never peaceful for long. In 1002, the Street Bryce's Day massacre placed the settlement within a far wider world of violence and political anxiety. That event reminds us that Oxford was already tied to larger tensions in England. It was not developing in isolation. From early on, it was exposed to fear, force, and the unstable logic of power. The future city of colleges and libraries first grew inside a landscape of uncertainty. So the earliest history of Oxford is not the story of learning, it is the story of transformation. A river crossing became a settlement became a religious center became a fortified place, and a fortified place became entangled in national crisis. That is the true foundation. Before Oxford was a university city, it was something more basic and perhaps more revealing, a place that kept becoming necessary. And that may be the most important beginning of all, not glory, not destiny. Just the repeated historical fact that this place mattered enough, again and again, to survive and to change. If the first phase of Oxford's story is about being noticed by history, the next phase is about being drawn directly into the machinery of power. After the Norman conquest of 1066, England was reordered through new systems of control, and Oxford was pulled into that transformation. The building of Oxford Castle and Street, George's Tower, was not simply an architectural change. It was a declaration. This place would be watched, governed, and secured within a new political order. The castle signaled something important. Oxford was no longer just a settlement by a river crossing. It had become a place the new rulers considered too important to ignore. Yet what makes Oxford unusual is that while power was being imposed in stone, another force was quietly gathering at the same time: scholarship. By the 12th century, scholars were increasingly drawn to Oxford. This was not a magical or accidental birth of learning. It happened because several conditions were already in place. Oxford had a strategic location. It had religious roots. It had growing political significance. Most importantly, it had become a place where people could gather, remain, and organize. Learning rarely emerges from abstraction alone. It grows where people can meet, teach, argue, and build institutions around shared intellectual life. At the same time, Oxford was still deeply entangled in national conflict. During the Civil War known as the Anarchy, the city became a site of political drama. The famous escape of Empress Matilda from Oxford in 1142 reveals how central the town had become. This was no remote provincial outpost. Oxford was a stage on which the struggle for the English crown could physically unfold. Its streets were part of the national story. One of the most important turning points came from outside Oxford itself. In 1167, Henry II banned English students from attending the University of Paris. That decision redirected intellectual energy. Sometimes centers of learning do not rise only because of their own brilliance, but because historical pressure forces people to gather elsewhere. Oxford benefited from that shift. It became a destination not just by design, but by circumstance. Yet, as scholarship grew, so did tension. The conflict between town and gown reveals an essential truth about Oxford's history. The university and the city around it were never perfectly aligned. The townspeople had one set of interests, laws, and daily realities. The scholars and clerics operated under another. These were not merely small cultural differences. They were structural tensions over privilege, authority, and identity. The crisis of 1209, which contributed to the migration of scholars and the eventual rise of Cambridge, shows that the growth of intellectual life could also produce fracture. Then came the formation of the early colleges, including University, Balliol, and Merton. This was a decisive change. Oxford ceased to be only a loose gathering of teachers and students. It became institutional. Learning was given architecture, rules, permanence, and social form. The city's new identity began to harden into something lasting. That is the crucial point. Academic Oxford did not emerge from peace and idealism alone. It was shaped by castles, kings, civil war, migration, and urban conflict. It was forged within pressure, and that is why its identity became so resilient. Oxford was not imagined into being. It was hammered into shape by history itself. No great center of learning moves in a straight line from foundation to glory. Oxford did not either. After its academic identity began to form, it entered centuries in which disease, social violence, and religious conflict repeatedly tested what kind of place it truly was. This is the phase in which Oxford was forced to confront a hard question. When society begins to fracture, can learning still hold its ground? In 1348, the Black Death reached England, and Oxford was caught in the catastrophe. For a medieval town, plague was not simply a medical event. It was a profound rupture in daily life. Streets emptied, institutions weakened, patterns of work, worship, teaching, and administration were disrupted all at once. In a world where education depended on physical presence, oral teaching, and close communal structure, population collapse was devastating. Oxford ceased to be only a place where knowledge expanded. It became a place trying to endure mass death. But disease was not the only danger. In 1355, the Street Scholastica Day riot exploded into one of the most infamous confrontations between townspeople and the university. This was far more than a local disturbance. It exposed a deep and long-standing fault line. Who truly shaped life in Oxford? The residents who worked, traded, and lived within the city, or the scholars protected by their own privileges and legal structures? The riot made visible the tension that had been building for generations. Oxford was not simply a city of reason. It was also a city of resentment, hierarchy, and unresolved power. That tension matters because it reveals a recurring truth in Oxford's history. It has always been both a real town and an exceptional academic space, and those two identities have often pulled against one another. The life of learning did not float above ordinary society. It was embedded in it, and sometimes in conflict with it. Then the 16th century brought an even deeper rupture. The English Reformation under Henry VIII transformed the religious and institutional landscape of the country, and Oxford could not remain untouched. In a place where theology, teaching, and social authority were closely connected, religious change was not abstract. It affected curriculum, loyalty, governance, and conscience. Questions of faith were simultaneously questions of power and questions of truth. Under Mary I, the burnings of Protestant martyrs gave Oxford an especially stark symbolic role in this struggle. These executions were not only acts of punishment, they were public statements about who could define belief, and by extension, who could define legitimate knowledge. In a city associated with scholarship and religion, The spectacle of burning bodies revealed the brutal intimacy between intellectual life and state power. This is what makes this period so important. Oxford was not protected from crisis by its learning. In some ways, its intellectual importance made it more vulnerable. Knowledge had to survive plague, civic hatred, institutional rupture, and ideological violence. Truth itself became dangerous. And perhaps that is why later Oxford would become so strongly associated with debate, evidence, argument, and disciplined thought. Not because it had always been peaceful, but because it had learned the cost of disorder. It had seen what happens when authority overwhelms inquiry, when resentment overwhelms community, and when fear overwhelms reason. Oxford did not simply accumulate knowledge in these centuries. It accumulated memory of how fragile intellectual life can be, and how hard it must fight to survive. If the earlier centuries taught Oxford how to endure, the next phase reveals something even more remarkable: its ability to reinvent itself. Oxford did not merely survive crisis, it learned how to transform crisis into a new kind of influence. This is the point at which the city begins to shift from being a place marked by religious and political upheaval into a place increasingly defined by thought, inquiry, and intellectual prestige. During the English Civil War in the 17th century, Oxford once again stood close to the center of national conflict. From 1642 to 1646, it served as the royalist capital. That fact alone tells us how far Oxford had come. It was no secluded academic settlement removed from the fate of the kingdom. When the monarchy needed a base, Oxford was chosen. The city became a place where government, war, strategy, and uncertainty were concentrated together. Its colleges and streets were not merely observing history, they were hosting it. Yet what makes Oxford distinctive is what happened afterward. Many cities are forever defined by the side they chose in war or by the ruins conflict leaves behind. Oxford, however, did not remain only a memory of royalist resistance. It reshaped its identity again. Slowly, the center of gravity moved away from direct political function and toward intellectual and cultural authority. Buildings such as the Sheldonian Theatre symbolized that change. This was not simply a handsome structure. It represented ceremony, public thought, and academic performance. It gave visible form to a city that was increasingly defining itself through learning and institutional confidence. The Radcliffe Camera, too, became more than a library building. It stood as an emblem of organized knowledge, of a culture that saw books, archives, and disciplined study as central to its identity. At the same time, Oxford became associated with figures connected to larger currents of modern thought. The world of the Enlightenment was not born in one place alone, but Oxford was one of the environments in which reason, observation, natural philosophy, political thought, and debate could take root and circulate. The names associated with this era help illustrate the shift. Oxford was becoming less a site of siege and more a site of argument, less a strategic refuge, more a framework for ideas. What matters most here is not only the presence of intellectual figures or beautiful institutions, it is the change in role. Oxford had once been valuable because of its position, then because of its strategic and political relevance, then because of its religious and academic structures. Now it was becoming valuable because of what it helped produce in the realm of thought. Ideas, once vulnerable within Oxford, were now among its greatest exports, and Oxford achieved this transformation without erasing its past. It did not clear away older layers to make room for a new identity. Instead, it built over them. Castle, church, college, theatre, and library coexisted. That layered continuity became one of Oxford's defining features. It did not become modern by destroying memory. It became modern by placing new functions inside old forms. This is the turning point in the whole story. Oxford was no longer merely a place shaped by history. It had become a place capable of shaping history in return. Through architecture, debate, scholarship, and institutional confidence, it emerged as something more than a historic city. It became a city of ideas, and that changed everything. There is a familiar image of Oxford: towers, quads, old stone, cloisters, bells, gowns, and a rhythm of life that seems almost untouched by time. But that image can be misleading if taken too literally. Oxford has survived for so long not because it remained frozen, but because it learned how to enter modernity without surrendering the core of what made it distinctive. The 19th century, especially, reveals that Oxford was not a museum of the medieval world. It was a city negotiating with the modern age. The coming of the Oxford Canal, and, later, the railway changed more than transportation. It changed Oxford's relationship to the rest of England. Greater movement of people, goods, and ideas meant the city could no longer imagine itself as semi-isolated within inherited academic traditions. It was drawn more fully into the economic and social transformations of the industrial era. Connectivity altered the meaning of place. Oxford was no longer simply where learning resided. It was also where networks converged. This raised a larger question. What would Oxford do with modernity? One answer emerged in the expansion of education for women. This was not a minor institutional reform. It challenged the social boundaries that had defined who was allowed to enter spaces of formal learning. For centuries, Oxford's structures had been shaped overwhelmingly by male privilege. The gradual opening of educational opportunity to women was therefore not just about access. It forced Oxford to confront what its intellectual identity actually meant. Was learning a universal ideal or a guarded inheritance? At the same time, religious and cultural life were also being renegotiated. The Oxford movement demonstrated that tradition was not dead in the modern city, but tradition was no longer passive. It had to be argued for, revived, reinterpreted, and placed in relation to new social realities. Oxford became a place where the past was not simply preserved, but actively debated. Then there was industry. The rise of Morris Motors and automobile production complicates any simple view of Oxford as a city of books alone. This was a city of labor, machinery, engineering, and material production, as well as scholarship. That detail matters deeply. It reminds us that Oxford was not outside the economic life of modern Britain. It was participating in it. The intellectual city and the industrial city existed together. This made Oxford's identity more layered than ever before. It was not just a university town, it was a meeting point between old and new Britain. Inherited prestige and social reform, ritual and transport, theology and manufacturing, ceremony and speed. It did not become Manchester, and it did not retreat into pure nostalgia either. Instead, it found a path that was distinctly its own. That is perhaps Oxford's real achievement in the modern era. It did not betray its past, but it also refused to be imprisoned by it. The city retained its visual continuity while allowing its social and institutional structures to evolve. In that sense, Oxford's modernity was not dramatic rupture, it was disciplined adaptation. And that adaptation is what kept the city alive. Beneath the stone facades and the language of tradition, Oxford was changing sometimes slowly, sometimes uneasily, but unmistakably. It remained old, but it also became modern. And that combination may be one of the most important reasons it continued to matter. By the 20th century, Oxford no longer belonged only to English history. What happened there now echoed far beyond the city, and often far beyond Britain itself. What is striking is that after so many centuries, Oxford was still doing what it had always done, redefining itself in response to a changing world. The difference was scale. Its influence had become global. The two world wars make it clear that Oxford was never an island of untouched scholarship. The city was connected to hospitals, research, wartime service, and the broader needs of a nation under pressure. Yet, the 20th century also reveals a less romantic truth. Oxford was still a city marked by social division. The Cutteslowe walls are an especially telling symbol. Even in a place associated with prestige and intellectual excellence, class boundaries could be physically enforced. This matters because it corrects any idealized image of the city. Knowledge did not automatically produce justice. Oxford, for all its learning, remained deeply human in its contradictions. And yet its power to shape culture grew in remarkable ways. The Inklings, with figures such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, turned Oxford into part of the imaginative life of the modern world. This is a significant reminder that Oxford's influence was not limited to formal scholarship or scientific research. The city also became a setting in which friendship, conversation, and literary imagination could generate works that would transform global culture. Oxford did not just produce ideas for lecture halls, it helped nourish worlds that millions of readers would inhabit. Science and medicine expanded that influence further. The wartime development and purification of penicillin demonstrated another side of Oxford's identity. Knowledge here was not only contemplative, it could become practical, life-saving, and immediate. The same pattern appeared in a different register with Roger Bannister's 4-Minute Mile. Oxford was not merely a place of theory, it was also a place where human limits could be tested and redefined. Then came the 21st century and the COVID-19 pandemic. Suddenly, Oxford once again stood at the center of a worldwide crisis, this time through the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. In that moment, the city's long history seemed to come into focus all at once. A place once known simply as a ford where animals could cross water had become one of the places to which millions looked for scientific hope. That is an extraordinary historical arc. But what makes it believable is not grandeur, it is complexity. Oxford was never one thing. It was a crossing point, a fortified settlement, a religious center, a place of scholarship, a site of riot, a political capital, a city of ideas, an industrial participant, a scene of social inequality, a cradle of literature, and a source of medical innovation. Each age forced it to answer a different demand. That may be the most honest conclusion of all. Oxford did not become a symbol because it was always great. It became a symbol because, across century after century, it kept finding a new way to become necessary. History challenged it repeatedly, and each time, it responded by taking on another role. So Oxford's story is not one of simple destiny. It is the story of a place repeatedly tested, repeatedly changed, and repeatedly made relevant again. And perhaps that is why it continues to matter now, not because it belongs to the past, but because it has never stopped negotiating with the future.